Statements by ministries. Minister of Aboriginal Affairs.
Thank you, Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in the legislature today on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit to acknowledge that October the 7th marks an important moment in Ontario's history. It's the 250th anniversary of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And as you've already introduced him, Speaker, I'm pleased to be joined by Chief Brian Laforme of the Mississauga of New Credit, who's standing here. And I'm also joined by Mr. Scott Cavan from Six Nations, who coincidentally is the Communications Advisor at the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs. While there are differing views on the Royal Proclamation, it is certainly considered one of the foundational documents in the relationship between First Nations and the Crown, and therefore between First Nations and all Ontarians. The proclamation, signed by King George III 250 years ago today, was a turning point in the recognition and protection of Aboriginal rights in Canada, rights that are now enshrined in Canada's Constitution. The King proclaimed that all newcomers could not settle the land until the Crown had first acquired the land from the First Nations who occupied the land. The principles that the King set out further developed and formalized the ground rules for treaty-making across what is now Canada. In Ontario, this revitalized process began the very next year with the Treaty of Niagara and continues to this day. Treaties formalize a relationship between the Crown and First Nations based on the principle of trust and mutual respect. We may not always share the same ideas about treaty implementation, but we are all confident that our government, through respectful and meaningful dialogue, will continue to work with First Nation partners to reach greater clarity. To this end, I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that my ministry is working with our partners on a number of fronts to encourage dialogue on treaty rights and implementation. On Manitoulin Island today and tomorrow, for instance, we are supporting a land and treaty conference hosted by the United Chiefs and the Council of the Mindu Mising. The conference will explore First Nation perspectives on treaty rights and responsibilities, as well as the duty to consult and Crown First Nation relations. Ontario will be participating in the Indigenous Bar Association's conference beginning today and running through Wednesday on the Chippewas of Rama First Nations, which will reflect on and mark the Royal Proclamation's anniversary. In July of this year, the Archives of Ontario and the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs brought the original Treaty 9 parchment up to James Bay for the first time since the treaty was negotiated in 1905. That was a part of a community treaty conference hosted by the Mushkegowuk Tribal Council. Members of this cabinet, including the Premier, have visited the far reaches of the province to foster stronger ties with tribal councils, provincial territorial organizations, and First Nation communities, from Akwesasne in the east on the St. Lawrence to Fort 7 at the very northern part of Hudson's Bay. Though treaties were made throughout the 18th, the 19th, and the 20th centuries, they continue to be as relevant to the people of Ontario today as they were the day they were signed. Mr. Speaker, awareness of treaties and their continued importance is not at the level that it should be. Many Ontarians do not realize that they are very likely living in an area covered by a treaty. To raise awareness, my ministry has developed a map of the various treaties across Ontario. It is the first detailed map of the treaties covering Ontario that the province has published since the early 1940s. The Premier has asked that we provide a copy of the map to all Ontario schools this fall. This government is engaged in present-day treaty-making right now in the 21st century. In the coming months, we expect the Algonquins of Ontario to vote on a draft agreement in principle to settle a claim first made in 1772. If ratified, negotiations and consultations will continue jointly among the Algonquins, Ontario, and Canada toward a final agreement. A final agreement will create a better environment for investment, stronger relationships among communities in Eastern Ontario, and long-awaited recognition for the Algonquin community. A final agreement will present Ontario's first modern-day constitutionally protected treaty. Mr. Speaker, as we commemorate the 250th anniversary of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, we recognize the need to continue strengthening the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. Working together as one Ontario, we are making progress in many areas. In the past 10 years, we have settled land claims at almost twice the pace of the previous 20 years. Our new relationship fund is investing in Aboriginal communities and organizations to help build capacity, work with government and the private sector to pursue strategic projects, and enter into partnerships that connect and benefit Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Ontarians alike. This government has made significant investments in Aboriginal education, housing and health programs to ensure that Aboriginal Ontarians have the same opportunities as everyone else in Ontario. Mr. Speaker, next year marks the 250th anniversary of the Treaty of Niagara, which renewed the Covenant Chain Alliance between the Crown and the First Nations of northeastern North America. As we look forward to working with First Nations to commemorate the Treaty of Niagara, I encourage all Ontarians to take a moment today and in the coming months to learn more about the Royal Proclamation and the treaties in Ontario. Ontario, as we know it, Mr. Speaker, would not exist without treaties or the generosity and continuing contributions of our First Peoples. And today, the future prosperity of our province is dependent on the full participation of all Ontarians, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Only in this way, Speaker, can Ontario be the fair and just society it aspires to be. Whether you are First Nation, whether you are Métis, whether you are Inuit, whether you live in a rural, urban, or remote part of Ontario, whether your family has been here for many generations, or whether you are new to the province, we are one Ontario.